Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I did in fact just get my bangs cut and it's rather humid in Los Angeles, so I do look like a bit of an 80s rock star. And we're gonna roll with it. Welcome to a writing Q&A, and this writing Q&A, even though it was not intended this way, happens to be following very well with when I hit 2,000 subscribers. So for starters, thank you guys so freaking much for subscribing, for joining the channel. It has been so surreal to watch it grow like this, and I'm just very, very grateful. So thank you. I asked you guys for some questions over on my Instagram stories at Brielle's Writing and on the YouTube community tab quite a bit of time ago. Actually, we are really overdue. It was a month ago that I asked you guys for these questions, and this is definitely something that I will be doing somewhat frequently going forward. So if you didn't get a chance to submit a question, not to worry, there will definitely be an opportunity soon. We have a little bit of strawberry milk, which has been my fixation beverage lately, and we're just gonna be chatting it up about writing, my writing projects, my process, all of the things. Question number 1, what made you decide to self-publish instead of trad publish? So I'm thinking I'm gonna make an entire video talking about this at some point in the future because it's a subject that I find really interesting. Before I get into this, huge disclaimer, I respect both traditional and self-publishing. I know there can sometimes be tensions around this question and an assumption that somebody is judging people who choose the other option. No judgment here. I have friends who really want to traditionally publish, and I have so much respect for that path. Any criticisms that I have of traditional publishing is solely for the traditional publishing industry, and there are criticisms that I feel about a lot of creative industries, not for people who are choosing to go that route. I totally understand the draw of traditional publishing. I wanted to give that disclaimer because I never want my sentiment to be twisted into me hating on people who want to be traditionally published. But in terms of why I personally want to self-publish, the thing that really got me back into writing was my fascination with watching the journeys of self-published authors. This was not something that I had even known about as a career path until the last several years. And once I discovered the world of being able to self-publish your books and essentially just run your entire own ecosystem of writing and publishing, I was hooked. So pretty much as soon as I got back into writing, I knew that being able to self-publish my books was a huge draw and something that looked really appealing to me from just a process perspective. I love the idea of really having the process in my own hands, of putting myself through different rounds of revision, hiring a cover designer, hiring an editor. The thought of orchestrating all of that and then being able to like orchestrate a release and everything was super fun and fascinating to me, and that was a huge draw to me with self-publishing. I also do just love the lack of gatekeepers in self-publishing and the amount of control that you're able to have over your own writing career. This is something that I love about YouTube as well, is the lack of gatekeepers, the fact that you can create something and put it out there and it can be entirely your own thing and no one else has to sign off on it in order for you to create and publish it. That's what I love about YouTube, and that's what I love about the idea of self-publishing as well. That being said, I don't think that is an excuse to not care about the quality of the work that you're publishing, obviously, but it is awesome that if you have an idea that you love, if you have a manuscript that you want other people to read, you can give yourself that sort of green light, you know what I mean? No one else can hold you back from publishing that work. It can be curated to your exact vision, and I just think that's so awesome. And I love the businessy side. I love the idea of being able to weave together my writing and my content creation to create an entire like business, all the facets that that could involve, being able to track like my book sales in KDP and being directly like face to face with all of that. That's fun and interesting to me personally. And I know some people don't feel that way. I think it's such a personal preference. It's what do you want out of your career? I also know that working for myself is and always has been a goal of mine, and I love how self-publishing could fit into that ideal of being able to set my own schedule, create my own deadlines, like have my own workflow and change my work priorities based on what I'm craving. Even little things like being able to genre hop, like if I wanted to write a contemporary romance after a fantasy book, no one could tell me not to do that if I was self-publishing, you know what I mean? So I love that level of freedom as well. Yeah, I mean, I could go on, but basically what it comes down to is I love the freedom, control, and the involvement in the business side of things that you get with self-publishing. That is very interesting to me personally. And I also do think, as someone who shares my writing process online, there is a very natural fit together between that and self-publishing. self-publishing. If I did not have an online presence, if I was not sort of creating this audience, the idea of trying to self-publish my books would maybe feel more intimidating or difficult. But knowing that I am creating an audience of people and some of those people probably will be interested in reading my book brings me some comfort that when I self-publish, I won't self-publish into the void. So I think that's a factor here as well. I think if I wasn't interested in creating a public platform around my writing in the way that I literally am right this second, I might be more drawn to traditional publishing because they would help with promotion and distribution and all of that. But knowing that I'm sharing my process and creating that audience is another reason why I think self-publishing works so well. And honestly, being able to share the intricacies of how I self-publish in the future is also something that really appeals to me. So it makes a lot of sense for it to just be part of my plan. The people whose careers I follow on YouTube and am really inspired by for the most part are self-published authors or writers who haven't published yet, but the careers where I'm like, wow, I would love to be doing that, it's self-published authors. So it just makes a lot of sense for me personally. And yeah, I would happily dive into that again in a future video, though I think I pretty much covered it right there. Any techniques for finding the right pacing of your novel? Pacing is so interesting because it's so almost hard to see. At least for me, it feels like something I can't quite get a pulse on until I'm revising. I don't know. What I've found so far, and by no means am I the expert on this because I'm still learning for sure how to master this, but pacing is a lot about balance. It's about making sure the different aspects of your story are in balance. It's making sure that you're having a good back and forth between scenes where a lot is happening and there's conflict and action and dialogue, and then scenes that are quieter and more focused on reflection or relationship building. It's about balancing those things. It's about balancing on a scene level between dialogue, action, description, internal monologue. To me, it's all about balance. It's about maintaining that balance. It's about not going on too long of a tangent about something that's irrelevant or that the reader doesn't care about, but it's also making sure that we have enough of those quieter moments to make sure that the story has the emotional impact that you want it to have. So it's a very intense balancing act that I'm still trying to figure out. Things that might help you improve pacing of your novel. One, you probably need some distance. If you're trying to assess the pacing, this is somewhere where I feel like beta readers will be able to provide really good insight, because when you're so close to a project and you're so in the nitty-gritty details of it, you might not even realize what is and isn't interesting. You might not realize what you're spending too much time on. Getting that second perspective, I think, is super important from a pacing point of view. Something else that I've been thinking about, and this is actually based off of something that Alyssa said in one of her videos. Shout out to Alyssa. Her channel is Alyssa in the Books, and I'm obsessed. She was reading a Sarah J. Maas book, and she said something along the lines of, I think Sarah forgot when she was writing this book what people come to her books for. And that just got me thinking. And I think that this is an interesting point that actually sort of applies to this pacing idea. I think pacing feels off when the writer is maybe focusing too much on something that the reader is not there for. And so I think this varies dramatically between book to book. So for example, if you're writing a romance, you're spending a lot of time focusing on unimportant details about the main character's family life, like a lot of time on that, the reader might feel like the pacing is lacking because what they're there for is the romance, they're there for the tension, and you're not providing it. Or if the reader is there for an action-packed book and you're spending a lot of time in quiet moments building, character relationships and vibes, they might think the pacing is lacking. So it has a lot to do with reader expectations as well, I think. And something that might be really appreciated and enjoyed in a high fantasy might be considered really dull and slow in a paranormal romance. What aspects of the book is the reader really there for based on how you're selling it or what their expectation is for this type of book? And are you delivering on that in a consistent way, like sporadically throughout the novel? Those are my thoughts. But pacing is difficult, and I encourage you to take some space and time away from your book if that's what you need to give yourself perspective on the pacing. Bring in that second opinion, or try and look at it from the lens of, if I'm the reader, what am I here for? Am I here for the vibes of the world building? Am I here for the romance? And am I providing enough of that? And again, focusing on that balance. Am I having a good balance between dialogue, action, description, world building, info dumps, and honestly, sometimes it might just be a case of moving pieces around. Maybe you can save a bit of information for later. Maybe you can reveal it earlier to make sure that the pacing is staying at that good clip. And little tweaks like that, even on a scene level, I think can make a big difference. The beginning of a book being slow is a common situation, and it makes sense, right? A lot of times at the beginning of the book, you're focusing on the setup. If you're worried about pacing specifically at the beginning of your project and hooking people, I'm a big fan of bringing the inciting incident up, making that happen in a snappier way. But I also think it's a case of maybe we don't need every bit of information right at the beginning. Maybe you can reveal some of it later. Maybe some of it isn't even necessary for the story. Think about those sorts of things. But also, I think it's okay for a book to require a little bit of time to get into it, within reason, of course. What inspires you to write, and how do you deal with imposter syndrome? In terms of what inspires me to write, on a day-to-day level, honestly, it's the project that I'm working on. I think if I wasn't in love with and passionate about my current project, it would be a lot harder to motivate myself. Coming from someone who ditched a lot of projects back in the day, I've seen that firsthand. When you go into a project and you don't love it, and maybe you have no idea where it's going, it's very easy to discontinue it, okay? The number of unfinished manuscripts I have in the past is disturbing, honestly. Also, something huge that inspires me to write is this YouTube channel. Like, the accountability that I get from making these little videos and knowing that there actually are people who would read this book if I put it out, huge, game changing. I don't know if I would feel the same way if I was working on a book with no intention to ever release it, or working on a book and not documenting the process at all. I think it would be a lot harder for me to motivate, honestly. But what inspires me, like what gets me in the mood for writing, I love going to an environment that I find inspiring. So that's typically a coffee shop. I love writing with other people around, especially if I can do a writing date with another writer. That is like peak to me. If we're able to bounce ideas off of each other and get excited, that's incredible. I love that. I actually really like doing writing sessions with another person. I think it's really fun. I'm often like sort of hit with inspiration about a specific idea or like a specific bit of dialogue or an image that I want to include in the book, and that will motivate me and hit me with some inspiration. Honestly, so many different things inspire me. I have this sort of little instinct in me to write that has always been present, though it's been dormant at different times in my life. When I was writing back in high school, you know, I was so young. I wasn't making content around writing, obviously. I feel like the fact that I did write as a kid, like in high school, which now I consider as a kid, and in the end of middle school, so maybe ages to like, I don't know, 13 to 16, let's say. The fact that I wrote back then shows me personally that it's a very natural instinct, because at the time I didn't have a lot of, I don't know what the word would be, maybe ulterior motives, you know what I mean? Like, sure, I was dreaming about being published, but it was a very pure time of my life, and the fact that I was interested in writing in that time, to me, shows that there was a genuine passion there that I don't think just goes away, you know? And it just feels like I've tapped back into that after being dormant for a long time. So yeah, I guess writing does feel natural in a lot of ways to me. How do you deal with imposter syndrome? Oh God. Honestly, this has really been rearing its head lately, more so than it was at the beginning of me working on this project. And I think it's because, one, I'm a lot closer to the hypothetical possibility of publishing, which is scary. I'm not gonna lie. I have a lot of fearful thoughts about that. Fear of what people might say about the book, criticism I might get, etc. That definitely gives me imposter syndrome, thinking about those possibilities, thinking about the fact that I'm a relatively new writer who's trying to make a book that's good. There is a part of me that's scared that I'm too new to writing to write something good, even though I do have history with different writing projects in the past. Imposter syndrome has been a big thing for me lately. It wasn't so much when I started this book because I was so at the beginning stages, and especially when drafting, because there's not really a pressure for it to be good yet, I was able to kind of not have a ton of imposter syndrome going on. Now that I'm about to enter revising, I do feel more so that pressure of like, okay, Brielle, if you can't make the book good at this stage, that's going to reflect badly on your writing skill. So that has been something that I've been dealing with, especially as I come to terms with the possibility that people are going to start reading this soon, in terms of like beta readers, or even like my friend Mick has read a couple pages at this point, and every time she reads a word of my writing, I'm just like hiding in the corner because I want to share work, but I'm scared of the reactions. So how do I deal with it? All of that is to say, that was just me going on about me having imposter syndrome. How do I deal with it? Sometimes I just need to take myself out of the echo chamber, you could say, out of the like authortube bubble, or just like the writing bubble. Like if I find myself maybe obsessing too much about watching a ton of craft videos and like picking apart my work on a sentence level, like when I get really in that zone of like, I'm focused maybe too much on this perfectionism, sometimes I just need to remove myself a little bit and be like, okay, but this story is fun and I like the concept, and let me focus on that for a bit. Let me focus on the community aspect of chatting with other writers. Let me focus on honestly just doing the work of what can I correct now with what I know right now? What can I make better about this project from the lens of current me. Sometimes you do need to get really granular and focus a lot on craft and like get into the weeds of reading Save the Cat and ingesting all of that. And then sometimes you do need a break from that, because I find when I spend too much in that zone of like hyper fixating, honestly, on my work and on it being good and all of my insecurities around writing, that's where things get dangerous for me. So sometimes I just need some distance. I need to go spend time with some non-writers maybe, or like focus on something else. So I think know when you need a break is key, and then a little bit more focused on the actual imposter syndrome part of it. I mean, I think that anyone who writes is a writer. I don't think you need to earn that title. If you do the thing and you love it and you're trying your best, you are a writer. That's my perspective. I've never been a huge fan of pretentiousness in any art. It actually is one of my biggest pet peeves, to be honest. People who say, oh, you're not a photographer unless you fit this, this, and this criteria, even if you like taking pictures. Oh, you can't call yourself this because you haven't achieved this. I just think that's all really silly, to be totally honest. And it's not something that I personally stand for. So I always try to check myself when I find myself feeling like an imposter. Like, hey, you love this thing. You're giving it your all. You're showing up. You're writing the words. You are a writer. You deserve to take up space. I think it's sad that imposter syndrome is so pervasive, because it means, you know, we all feel like we have something to prove. We're all scared of other people's opinions to some extent. And I feel like as long as you are giving it your best, you're trying to improve, you're putting in the work, there's nothing to be insecure about. You're only going to get better with time. Improvement is inevitable. None of your work has to be seen or experienced until you feel it is ready to be seen and experienced. And all of those things should be a comfort to you. If you're showing up, if you're writing the books, you are a writer. Okay? Whoever needs to hear that today, there you go. Which writers do you think inspired your style, and how would you describe it? If you have any tips on finding the right voice for a story, I would love them. Ooh, okay. I mean, I've talked about many times that I'm a Sarah J. Maas girly. She has influenced me for sure. That being said, I do not think I have a copy-paste style of Sarah J. Maas. I think the tone is different. I think the vibes are different in my book. I do feel like pretty much everything I read impacts my writing in even a slight way. You know, I read The Inheritance Games recently. I read The Serpent and the Wings of Night. And I feel like I can see the ways that both of those books honestly have influenced my style. Yeah, I just feel like all of us, whether we acknowledge it or not, in some form are a product of things we consume, and we mix that with something innate in ourselves. Like, you know, there's some essence of me that's always hopefully going to be present in my writing. I think that's the case with all of us. We inherently make things original through our own, just who we are, like our own core. But then we're also, of course, taking little bits of style and maybe even bits of language or perspective from what we're reading. So yeah, those are some of the things that I think may have influenced my current style. Do you have any tips on finding the right voice for a story? I assume you mean like the right character voice or the right like narration voice. What is your character a product of? Kind of going off of what I was just talking about in terms of my writing style, but what circumstances, beliefs, relationships has fed into how they see their current situation and maybe the world around them? And that I think can influence a lot about the voice that they're approaching their situation with. And this might not be something that you know right away. This was definitely not something I realized right away, but my character kind of walked onto the page with a certain attitude, and it took me some time to get to understand why she had that certain attitude. So you might not know all the pieces, you might know the backstory, but not how that fits into the voice, or you might have the voice but not know why that's the voice. Start with what you have, and then hopefully it'll unfurl as you go. But I don't know, to me, a character voice, a lot of it is a product of either what they've experienced or something innate about themselves. Are they an optimist, a pessimist? Does that come out in their voice? Are they an anxious person? Are they paranoid? Do they have trust issues? Are they depressed? Are they excited about their life? All of these things feed into the voice that they're going to speak from. This is one of the big reasons why the idea of jumping between projects feels really not great to me, is because I think I would have a really hard time switching back and forth from voices. I think once you're immersed in a project and you really get to know the voice, it becomes a lot easier to embody it when you're writing. I've been thinking a lot about flaws of a character, and this is coming from reading Save the Cat, which really emphasizes the importance of making your characters really flawed, and so that you can have a drastic arc by the end of the book of them becoming less flawed, ideally. So I've been thinking a lot about that, and I think that that is a huge thing to consider as well when you're coming to voice. How can you maybe use your voice to emphasize your character's flaws, or maybe the things that they feel a little bit hopeless about, or the things that they have given up on? You know, how can you use voice to emphasize that? I think that's something interesting to think about. And then in terms of like tone, because maybe that's also sort of what you're asking about, like what's the right tone for a story? Does it need to feel like humorous in terms of the narration? Does it need to feel more sad and gritty or angsty? Again, I think taking into account the scenario that your character has found themselves details in. I think it can be fun to maybe have a contrast between your voice and your circumstances. Percy Jackson is a great example where the tone of the book is very humorously sort of out of sync with a lot of the content. Like, they're in these super dangerous situations, but Percy has such a humorous, sort of irreverent voice that it creates this just like really fun contrast between his voice and the circumstances. So that's something to think about too. Is that something you want to create, or do you want to fully lean into the vibes of what's happening in the book? Also, like, what do you want the reader to be feeling while they're reading the book? Do you want them to feel swept up in it and like it's so exciting and rich and like such an immersive experience? Like, reading ACOTAR, I felt like that book was like honey. I don't know how else to put it. It was like rich and like thick and good, you know? Or do you want the reader to maybe be like a little more contemplative? Do you want it to feel more philosophical, more airy, maybe more literary leaning? Think about all these things, you know? What do you want the reader experience to be? I know personally, I do not like a sad book. I don't like reading a book and crying. Don't put me in that. The only time I will allow emotions is in fantasy contexts, okay? If I'm reading a contemporary, it better be, for the most part, pretty lighthearted, or I don't know. It can't be like that grueling. So that's something I know about myself as a reader, and likewise, I don't think I'm interested in writing like a tragic, heartbreaking story. That's just personally not of interest to me. So yeah, those are some of the things that you can think about when it comes to voice and tone, some of the things that I feel like I asked myself. But I do think at the end of the day, it will also kind of find you, you know, as you're going through the writing process. I think if you're really immersed in the story and you're like fully committing to it, it will in some senses find you as well. Single space or double space, what do you use? I use whatever is the default in Scrivener for drafting. I think it's probably double space or 1 point something. I don't know. Single space is hard to read for me, but at the end of the day, this does not matter, guys. For the drafting process, I don't know if this person was asking about it in terms of formatting, but like whatever feels most comfortable. This is something that I heard in an advice video a long time ago. If you're getting caught up on things this small when you're setting up your document, it doesn't matter. Like, you know, the book will come out in whatever form and you can fix it later. What is your favorite and least favorite part of the writing process? This is a great question. I haven't been through all of revision yet, so I have no doubt I will have a fresh answer once I've revised on what my least favorite part of the writing process was. Looking at drafting in specific, honestly, one of my favorite parts is the brain dumping portion. I love the brainstorming of ideas. Writing dialogue is super fun to me, even though it's extremely challenging when I get it and it's working and I'm having the time of my life. Writing banter between my characters, that is the juice for me. I love writing the romance scenes. That is also the juice for me. Least favorite part of the writing process, for this book, it was writing the camping scenes, guys. I'm not even gonna lie. I skipped over a lot of them because I just could not find a way to make it interesting for myself. And this is something that I've been brainstorming with my friend Mick because I know I need to add some camping scenes. It has to happen, but that was the least favorite part of this writing process. So writing, I guess, the more dull scenes that I wasn't excited about, which seems pretty like self-intuitive. But honestly, overall, I had a pretty enjoyable drafting experience, so I really can't complain. I think one of the things that's going to end up being the most exhausting, but also the most rewarding, is line editing. Specifically, like getting sentences to sound pretty. It's been one of the things I'm noticing the most as I'm doing the reread, and my notes on the document is just repetitive phrases, like things that just don't sound good. And I think correcting a lot of that is going to be a pretty heavy revision. I'm hoping in future rough drafts, maybe I'll catch myself more in the moment, but at the same time, I was very much trying not to edit as I go. So that's going to lead to a bit of a messier draft on a line level. So maybe that's just something I have to accept, or maybe in the future, I'll reconsider whether editing as I go is a good strategy for me, because with this book, I proved to myself that I'm capable of finishing a project. I wrote the book. I wrote it relatively quickly, 6 months, but to me that's relatively quickly. After that sort of one completed draft that I got out of my system, I'm no longer worried that I won't finish future projects if I want to finish them. Therefore, I'm not sure that I'm as concerned about what would happen if I stopped to edit. Yeah, I have a feeling the line level editing, it'll be really satisfying when I do it because it's going to upgrade the book so easily, just with some cleanup and some making it readable, but I'm sure it's going to be very exhausting while I'm doing it. What do you do once you've come up with a vague idea for a story? What's your next step? Honestly, what I've been doing so far, and what I kind of like as maybe a possibility for my process going forward, is letting an idea marinate you know, letting an idea stick in my head for a long time before I actually go to draft it, because for me, an idea, you know, it might present itself as a vague idea, but it will probably snowball and flesh out a little bit on its own the longer it sits in my head, within reason, of course. And I think there's something to be said for that marination process, because the more ideas that I can have going into the draft, the better. The easier it's going to be for me as like a plancer if I already have quite a lot that's been marinating inside my head. So I think after I have a vague idea for a story, one, I'm going to write down everything. I'm going to write down every tiny bit of an idea into a brain dump. I'm going to make sure that I have that documented so I don't forget it. And then I'm just going to let it marinate. I'm going to take notes when they come to mind and just let it sit for a while. And then eventually I will do a proper brainstorm document, dump everything I have, all the pieces in there, and start creating a sort of vague arc for the book. And I think the specificity of that outline will vary depending on the project for me. For book 2, it looks like it's going to be maybe a little bit more specific, but that makes sense because I have an entire book's worth of material to jump off of. And maybe in the future, I think in general, I'll have a bit of a loose outline, but that's what my process is looking like at the moment after I come up with a vague idea. 2 people asked, do you have any other ideas or stories in the works after Project The Wall? Great question. So I have one inkling of an idea. I've been reading a lot of vampire books, like a lot of vampire books, and it put me in the mood to maybe possibly consider writing a vampire book in the future. But I'm not going to even touch that concept, I don't think, until I'm either done with this current duology or have it in like the last stages, because like I said, for me personally, the idea of working on multiple projects at once is really overwhelming, and I don't think that would work well for me. So I'm letting this concept marinate, and I think that would be a paranormal romance standalone, is my thought process. How did you get the idea for Project The Wall? It started with the opening scene. It started with the idea of a girl on a date with a prince and her telling him about the wall. So that opening scene was the first thing that came to me, and it just sort of naturally developed from there. I honestly couldn't even tell you when the idea first sparked. I was working on it very lightly at first, way before I ever started this channel or started talking about the book. But yeah, it was just a spontaneous idea. My ideas don't feel like they come from anywhere. They just sort of pop up. And then I'm like, wait, what about that though? And it's interesting because I can't even pinpoint an exact influence. Like with the idea I just told you guys about the possible vampire book, I can pinpoint the exact things that I've been reading lately that inspired that sort of concept. With Project The Wall, I don't know where it came from. It feels very, I don't know. Some people have told me that it has parallels to books that they've read in the past. Things like the Shatter Me series or the Red Queen, I think it was. I've never read any of those. So it's definitely not from there that I'm getting those ideas. I genuinely don't know. It just came to me. What is your favorite type of scenes to write? I already kind of answered that, but yeah, it's the dialogue heavy, bantery romance scenes that do it for me every time. And they're my favorite scenes to read, and they're my favorite scenes to write. And there's a few in this current project that just like, they light my soul on fire. My friend asked me the other day, like, do you have a crush on your love interest? And I was like, yes. Like I'm literally blushing every time I write an interaction with him. Okay, that's gonna be it for this little Q&A. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. If you want to submit questions for things like this in the future, make sure you follow me over on Instagram at Brielle's Writing. I post a lot on my stories with real-time updates and asking for your guys' thoughts, opinions, questions, etc. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, comment a fairy emoji down in the comments. Thank you guys again for being here, for getting me to 2,000 subscribers, and for being interested in hearing about my writing process. That's so fun that you guys actually had questions. So thank you guys for submitting, and I'll see you next week with another one. Bye!